Hello, Professor Palriwala. Thank you for agreeing to extend our conversation. Here are the rest of the questions we had prepared for you. In your talk at the Malayalam University, Kerala, in that he states that comparison is fundamental to how we perceive the world in our everyday lives, but that we have to make explicit the comparisons that we are making. What factors do you think keep us from making these comparisons explicit?
So Pollock is one of many who has made this point. As I've written elsewhere, many anthropologists, Levi-Strauss, sociologists, Weber, and philosophers have argued that comparison and synthesis through contrasts are intrinsic to our ability to think, to lived experiences, to systematize knowledge structures, and to sociological methodology. Now, ancient Indian philosophers have also drawn on the comparative method, but I do not know enough to be able to comment on it. However, leave aside the layperson, even for scholars, comparisons may be so embedded that we do not see we are making them until we explicitly acknowledge and look seriously at how others think, live, sort, and categorize. There is a saying that the fish do not talk about water, as that is all they know. If they're removed from it, they may recognize that they cannot breathe, but not how other living beings breathe and live, assuming that they recognize that these are other living beings. The scientist, however, has to compare how different beings breathe to understand the significance of oxygen and the interdependence of living beings, that we and plants draw on different components of air, that fish need oxygenated water. It's similar in the case of the social sciences and the arts. There is a tendency for most cultures and peoples to naturalize their own mode of behavior and living and traditions, and take it as the standard for the good, and not see that their ways of living, their standards are specific, relative, made in particular societies and cultures, and are changeable. We carry buried values and ideas that shape our everyday actions, our lives, and our thinking, and which are often articulated in traditions, but sometimes also in traditions of question and dissension. Now, even as scholars, we do this. We add to those givens, to those assumptions of what is, our past analyses and findings too. We can often take them as final truths and as even transcendental, like lay people do. Thus, often we do not realize that we are in fact making comparisons and that we are being judgmental, that those embedded givens is what we are thinking with. Thus, if the social scientist is to understand how and why cultures or a society may have changed, there is a past and a present that is being compared, and it is crucial to be explicit about whether the benchmark is assumptions of an ideal past or a desirable present or a practiced past with all its difficulties, and an actual present with all its difficulties in which dominant norms and varied practices go together. We have to know which groups' practices, which texts, which time we are looking at and how we are comparing, to know whether what we are saying is just a given, to be just accepted, or can be understood beyond that. Too often this is not done.
In the same talk, you said that society and culture are not the same, except in the broadest sense. You covered the broader similarities in the same lecture, the link to which I will share, but could you please start by telling us what your understanding of culture is and how it differs from society?
Okay. In its broadest sense, society includes various domains that are variously demarcated. economy, polity, family, religion, ideology, and culture, social organizations, institutions, material structures. Depending on how somebody conceptualizes culture, culture is just one aspect of social life and organization. Or it may be taken as being everything that is not nature. In fact, of course, culture may be both. But if one is going to pursue a study of culture and say something more, then we need to move beyond the idea of just not nature, not least because we also know nature only through culture. So material cultures are of critical interest. But when we think of culture as a concept, when most people think of culture as a concept, we are primarily thinking of learned norms, social and moral values, religious and other beliefs, the ideational, which appears as both objective and subjective, as also intellectual and artistic pursuits. There is, yes, a confusion here. That is, it's apparent. But it's one that we have to hold on to, for that's life. Society and culture are substantively different, but one cannot do without the other. So no culture is outside the social practices, hierarchies, and the political economy in which it emerges, and which it guides and which gives meaning to it. Thus, if we look at family as one example, we can say there are particular social relations and material dimensions of householding and of caring or not caring, but also cultural norms and values which people aspire to in the way they live together, in whether they care or not. And these values can sometimes hide the everyday realities of familiar life, the culture of the family, the supposed espoused culture of the family can hide these everyday realities, especially if those everyday realities and practices are contrary to those ideal norms of harmony and love and care. So if we are to analyze social interaction and social process and change, we cannot take society and culture in this sense as one and the same, but nor can we look at just one. There are, of course, a lot of other ideas and distinctions which would be required to pursue this study, but I'm not going into them, other than the distinction between the normative ideas, values, expectations on the one hand, and social interaction and organization on the other. There's another set of common ideas, actually, which is important to look at, especially propounded by ruling ideologies, but also in many earlier sociological theories that can hide this distinction and thereby our analytical ability. That is the myth of social coherence and integration, and of cultural coherence and integration and cultural unity as the normal state of life and of society. In fact, social and cultural contradictions are at the core of social structure and of cultural systems, and it's what gives them life. At times, it's social contradictions which lead to cultural change. At times, it's cultural contradictions which lead to both cultural and social change. But that distinction and the recognition of the lack of coherence and contradiction is very important. So what it means is we have to look at the process and not only at norms. And what it also means is that this demands constant work from both people and ruling regimes to maintain the current state of ways of life and power. And it demands and enables also change. It is at the roots of change.
You also throw nation state into the mix, saying that people often confuse it with what a society is. Would you please share your understanding of what a nation state is and how it differs from what a society is, and reasons that make us confuse it with nation state?
Yeah, all difficult distinctions. So here I'm thinking of society as a concrete, large or small group of people located in a particular space or region or time, tied together in their social life, even if not always in full cognizance and consciousness of each other. And also all the ways of living of all who are part of the group. Now, there can be a multiplicity of cultures in one society, a multiplicity of societies and cultures in a nation state. Because a nation state is, on the one hand, a polity, on the other hand, the idea of a certain common life. But certainly if we look in India, where despite the idea of the nation as an imagined community of people who think of themselves as being one community or being one nation, and who think they know each other, they're in concrete, and in imagination and symbolic systems. They may think that, but there are also many more. Within the nation state of India, there are many societies and cultures with greater or lesser interaction with each other. They may share many commonalities, but they're also different in many ways. Geographic separations have also meant little interaction with some of the societies and cultures which are within the Indian nation state. It's meant that there are not just geographical distances, there may be social and cultural differences. And yet, in this nation state, but even otherwise, the lines separating societies or cultures have been porous. Undoubtedly, given that it's a nation state, given the fact that they can abut that through commerce, trade, all sorts of ways there have been interaction, but also with the nation state, there are broad structures, processes, institutions that bring this plurality of nations and cultures together, which in fact make that imagined community of the nation, the constitution, political processes, the bureaucratic and tax systems, and yes, in the Indian context, the caste system, the structural inequalities, the macroeconomic processes, and patriarchal gender relations, which seem to cut across and bring together. But we have to keep in mind is that while the polity is central to the nation state, it is not all that makes our everyday lives. And often what is put forward along with that, of course, is the idea of a single civilization. And that can be a very powerful idea, especially in terms of trying to define the idea of a nation. And it is often the idea of civilization is mobilized, it's defined, and it's used to strengthen the idea of a specific nation state. But it also has often led to false ideas of internal uniformity and unity. It hides structural inequalities and is also used to make sometimes a sort of radical contrast with other civilizations. The one we hear most often is the Western civilization versus the Eastern, or the Occidental versus the Oriental. What this idea can do of taking the nation state as, because it's a single polity, it will have a single civilization, what it can do is a denial of the many cultures and ways of life, of values, of the differences from within one society even. And certainly the many cultures and differences within what has been named as a civilization. It can move towards making one group or cultural complex hegemonic within that nation state. It often is based on the idea that all are same. It can seal those porous borders I talked about between groups. And that's why when we distinguish society and culture, we also need to keep in mind that the nation state may be more than them, but may also not be able to encompass all the fullness of the many societies and cultures. And insisting that there is sort of one society, one culture, one civilization within a nation state can in fact weaken that nation state. Whereas if we recognize and acknowledge the many societies and cultures, they're learning from each other, but also possibly their oppressions and inequalities vis-a-vis each other. and think of the nation state as trying to do away with these oppressions and inequalities, it can strengthen the readiness and desire of people to live in one polity, to be part of that one nation state. So depending on the nature of the polity and the acknowledgement of the many cultures and societies which are within that nation state, and as I said, especially true of India, the porosity of societies and cultures may be closed or made more permeable, may be made more, the lines between them may be made more harmonious or more conflictual.
According to Joseph Campbell, late American writer and professor of literature, quote, "Man should not be in the service of society, society should be in the service of man." What does this quote mean to you as a sociologist?
Okay, I've not read Joseph Campbell, but I can give my own take on this and what I think would be a sociological view. So, society is made of human beings in relation to each other. It is made through social relations. Just as we only become persons, human beings, people, in relation to each other, society also does not have any God-given, ordained origin, which says that it's perfect and everyone can just bow to it. In fact, Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, says that even God, or particularly God and the idea of the divine, is a creation of society, and the collective rituals that religion began with were paths to create social solidarity and make society appear as more than the individuals that make it up. So society is more than the individuals that make it up in that context, but is also the image of society is a creation, in fact, of society and the people who make it up. So I see various aspects to this idea of Durkheim and what you have quoted from Mr. Campbell. One is that the justifications of cruel society, of exploitation, of relations and ways of being, of a refusal for change, are often made through talking of how we must serve our society, our nation, our family, etc., rather than the reverse. And without any openness or being upfront about these problems within our society, our family, our culture, our nation, the exploitation, the discrimination within it. Or even without then being able to draw on the multiple sources of creativity and goodness, which the various aspects of the social, cultural may have within it. I think this idea that people must serve society can also lead to fascistic tendencies, as the dominant and the status quo is often taken to define that society, or a particular person is seen to represent that society, a particular god is taken to represent that society, and then all must serve that particular status quo, that particular god, that particular leader, etc. Now, if in fact we accept that society or nation should be for its members and for its citizens, but as I've said, it's always made by people in relation to others. If we start from there, then the ideal that society is for all its members would have to be striven for, because we would recognize that the current society is in fact not for all. We would recognize that it doesn't actually work for all at the moment. Now, this recognition requires acceptance of the principle that society must serve the people who make it up rather than the reverse. For only then can we question and move to transform that society. It also then reminds us, actually, that agency, people's ability to act, to do things, is always relational. It reminds us that the internal contradictions of culture and social relations and institutions too enable, and as I've said earlier, demand and both stop and enable both agency and change.
Talking about Mr. Campbell, we can't be too far away from rituals. He talked about many of them from different parts of the world and the different meanings they held, fundamental, diverse, and practical. It would be interesting to know what rituals mean to a sociologist and what they have been able to reveal to you about our society.
Okay. So it's often assumed that a ritual, for lay people, a ritual is a religious ceremony with prescribed words, artifacts brought into relation with each other, actions, all given by tradition, oral or written, or by a religious text, and which are conducted by the ritual expert, and that they are embedded in religious values and beliefs. A sociologist does go beyond this. And, let me again go back to Durkheim, because I think his book on religion is often a starting point for many sociologists wanting to look at ritual. In trying to understand religion, he saw beliefs and rituals as the two elements of religious life, of religion. Rituals were the performance, according to him, of collective representations and beliefs, a concrete manifestation of a collectivity. Through rituals, through that enactment of those rituals, the life and reality of that community was made visible, was brought into being. The intangibles of beliefs and actions were given a life and a reality for the participants. Now, rituals then became central to the power of religion and the force of tradition. They become a sort of concentration and reification of belief, of the relationships between believers and of the participants with each other. So in this understanding, rituals affirm that the individual can only be human in culture, in society, in social relations. And it also argues that it's the ritual that makes the sacred rather than the reverse. It's the ritual that separates the sacred from the non-sacred. It brings in prohibitions as a form of ritual, and it enables access to the sacred. And of course, there are rituals which are rites of joy, rites of celebration, rites of atonement, rites of mourning, rites of passage, where people move through critical points in their life cycle. Now, in all this, what we see is that ritual brings together the theory and practice of religious belief. It brings together the idea of fact and value in both proscribed and prescribed ways in an orderly manner. And this is why often those who are in power in the religious hierarchy wish to assert the rightness of particular religious practices, for their belief systems rest on them. And often religious schisms are based on then contesting the way in which rituals have been done. But what we have to keep in mind is that for believers, it is ritual which makes things happen, because it's through rituals they enter into a conversation with the divine. And that is why the efficacy of the ritual is seen as being dependent on exactly how it's performed, who performs it. Now, believers can differ in answering this question, and which leads to changes in ritual, or as I've said, to schisms and new religions. But with religious hierarchies often asserting their right to decide questions of how and when and why. And yet, of course, rituals are constantly being changed. Its correct form being argued over. New rituals are being made. Hierarchies have this sort of internal jostling for power, or as dissenters argue for a different way of belief, it is about actually not just religious power, but secular power too. Now, having said all this, what becomes important for the sociologist, I think, is to go beyond the idea of the religious ritual and of ritual as only relating to ideas of the supernatural or the otherworldly or some deity. As I've said, rituals are actually about relations and power relations within society. But if we go beyond that, we can, yes, think of a very wide range of rituals. They are the rituals of nationhood, for example, the national anthem, the Republic Day parade, the flag hoisting on Independence Day and on other days, all of which in different ways reaffirm the idea of the nation as a collectivity, the correct sort of flag, how it should be flown. There are also rituals of commemoration of historical events which have taken place. There are rituals of commemoration which the family has when they come together, but there are also rituals of commemoration of struggles and of protests. There are rituals of friendship. Okay? Gift giving to friends or birthdays are also, in that sense, rituals. They're affirming a person's life, they're affirming social relations, they're affirming the associations, they're affirming the common purpose, maybe, of the protest actions, of whatever historical event took place. All of these rituals, like the rituals, rites of passage, they also have another role, of course. They make the break from everyday, from the mundane. They enable a sort of that interruption which breaks the boringness of everyday life, but then bring us back to the everyday, to the mundane, reaffirm society in that process. Now, when we see collective life being made visible and real, and we see the past being brought into the present, we see the value of relationships being asserted, we're seeing individuals being made members of society through these rites of passage. Okay, these are things that rituals do. And these are reasons why people may enjoy rituals or hate them. In some, all the participants have a say in how the ritual is to be done, who will be performed. But often participants may not have the say, or they don't even think about it. They just follow what they have been told is the way to be done, or they follow the powerful ritual expert. So what this also means we have to keep in mind is that rituals are also exclusionary and boundary making and boundary marking and can be hegemonic. So in India, for example, we see the exclusion of certain castes, of the poor, of people, of a different religion or region, of women, from many ritual performances, not just the religious. So in a sense, the gamut of rituals, religious or secular, are about both affirming something larger than us, but also affirming the everyday, bringing us back into it, about reaffirming social relations as something more than us, simultaneously reiterating and reaffirming power structures and inequalities of varied hues. I mean, what I'm suggesting is rituals can be about reaffirming democracy or a denial of it. For whatever it is, rituals are rarely neutral. They always are bringing together certain beliefs, certain ideas, certain values with structures of community relations and power.
In setting the stage for your talk at the Malayalam University, you touched upon something that you called critical consciousness, while explaining the difference between empirical and empiricism. In that, empiricism does not let us enrich our understanding of the world we live in through critical consciousness. Clearly, there are many questions embedded in this, but the one we're most interested in is in understanding, as a sociologist, what you meant by critical consciousness, both as put together, that is critical and consciousness, and especially consciousness by itself.
Okay, so first of all, consciousness is the way we cognize, know, think about what we are doing. Often when people talk about the idea of mindfulness, okay, mindfulness is also about being conscious, doing things which you very consciously do. But consciousness can also be just what is there at an everyday level in terms of life, the way you live. When one talks about critical consciousness, what one is trying to say is that as a sociologist, but also very often as thinking beings in our world, we must go beyond the surface. The sociologist must go beyond just so stories. This is what happened. This is what happened. We have to go beyond what the dominant voices and ideologies say is or say should be, and ask, how did this happen? Why did it happen? What makes it so? What are the various layers of social relations, of cultural, political, economic relations which make what appears on the surface? So critical consciousness is, in a sense, a constant interrogation of what you see, what you think you know, the way you believe, the way you announce what you are going to do. It's also a constant interrogation of what people say they are, of their pronounced intentions, of what social actors announce that they are going to be doing, while trying at the same time to understand what gives them meaning, what is their consciousness about what they're doing, what they think about their lives. So a critical consciousness entails a questioning of yours and others' certainties and givens, without disrespecting those you are conversing with, the people who are your interlocutors. So the critical consciousness may not mean that in the immediacy you say, oh, but I think you're wrong. No, a critical consciousness may also say, yes, you are right, but can we take this a little beyond what you have said? Or you step back later and say, okay, let me think how I can understand this beyond what appeared to me immediately. I'm trying to remember was it Martin Luther King, who said, seeing is not necessarily believing. And I think that is what is also important over here.
In the talk, you spoke in some sense about the original purpose of social anthropology and sociology, where social anthropology studies the description of the other and sociology as an understanding of the self. I'm aware that both the explanations were made in context, but if possible, I'd like to know if sociology continues to be the study of self, and also what sociology has been able to unearth and uncover about what the self is.
Okay. Now, social anthropology, as it emerged, has been described as a study of the other, of societies which were other than that of the scholar, and the societies which were also othered by the scholars, and the societies which the scholars were coming from. Social anthropology began as the study of non-literate societies, as societies and cultures that those documenters, those scholars, said were without history, societies that the European and North American scholars saw as primitive because they were pre-capitalist, they were stateless, and according to them lacked everything that they saw as the epitome of civilization, which they were themselves. Now, even though the colonial enterprises took them to societies and cultures, be it in Latin America or India, China, Africa, that gave the lie to these ideas about the societies they were looking at, and even though many individual scholars developed an empathy and respect for those they were studying, this othering and primitivization remained. So when I wrote about studying the self, what I was referring to was studying one's own society. It was a short form to indicate that sociology tends to study their own society. The origins, of course, came with when the early European scholars who were studying other societies in Europe, the UK, etc., when they started studying those societies, they were called sociologists. Weber, for example, in particular, but also others. So when we come to the practices being taken up in the Indian context, whether social anthropology or sociology, once Indians started these practices, these lines between social anthropology and sociological study, sociological practices got blurred. Because if they were doing social anthropology, they were largely looking at communities within the Indian context. When they were doing sociology, they were looking at communities within the Indian context. Now, one reason this also got blurred, of course, was that a substantive portion of the previous social studies on groups and cultures lying within the Indian subcontinent had been done by earlier social anthropologists, or of course historians, economists, and in literature. But perhaps even more important is this issue which comes up when one thinks of, when one looks at what I'd said earlier about the multiple societies and cultures in the Indian context. So if an Indian scholar is going to do a study in India, and is going to study their own society because they're studying in India, there's a question, what is that scholar's own society? Okay. Because, of course, India as a nation state consists of multiple cultures and societies. So what it means is that an Indian sociologist or social anthropologist can remain within the Indian nation state and yet study cultures other than their own, societies other than their own. They can look at a different region or religion or language or caste or class other than the one in which the researcher was born into. Now, while this is a great opportunity for Indians who want to practice sociology or social anthropology, it also carries all the dangers of those aspects which we have critiqued of the colonial anthropologists and scholars, where they othered those other societies. They took their own society as the standard for civilization and looked at the others as being primitive, without history, because they didn't have their own history and culture. And we do see this at times within even local studies by local scholars who take what others have done as not being quite, as being primitive, as being not quite not high culture. And of course, one factor which also comes into this is if you look at the history of education, higher education, research, the civil service in the Indian context, most of them tended to be upper castes and often with very few also from various minority communities, and very many of them from what is sort of the central parts of India rather than its peripheries. And as a result, either those other groups did not get studied, or they were made invisible, or the stereotypes which they had of them continued over here because they did not see that they were othering, that they were using their own culture as the comparative standard. And, this becomes a problem then. But as I said, sometimes studying the self or studying the other can be crossed in different ways. I can give the example of my own doctoral research over here, maybe. So was I studying my own culture or was I not? I went to do fieldwork in a village in Rajasthan. So I was born into a community from Rajasthan, a fairly close-knit community at that time. spread all over the country. So I had never actually lived in Rajasthan for more than a few days. I was not well versed with the local language, even though it was a language which many family members spoke within the family. I was not even clear of all the ramifications of my caste, partly because, of course, you only tend to meet other upper caste people if you come from a somewhat privileged background. I did not know the rural at all. So I'd studied caste, I'd studied the rural, I'd studied ways of earlier studies of Rajasthan. And so it was not that I went in completely unaware, but the immediate direct experiences I did not have. In the 1 year of living in this multi-caste, multi-religion village, in the broad region from which my ancestors had migrated, where even at that time, hardly any women were educated, leave alone the secondary level, where caste lines were clear, everyone knew each other's caste, but where there would be some amount of interaction, if nothing else, for services, etc., but also on social occasions, where the religious communities also were distinct, but also interacted in all sorts of different ways, which were new to me, where civic facilities were minimal, even though in this village where I was, it was more than elsewhere. There was at least electricity for a few hours. There was at least a tap at the village well from where I could draw water rather than wait for somebody to pull a bucket up. What all this meant was that I had to also relearn the everyday life which I had led. I had to interact with people in many different ways. Initially, it was difficult, but the learning process for me was very critical, I think, for becoming a sociologist or an anthropologist. And I think that is one of the aspects also which become very important for any sociologist or anthropologist. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this is also recently I've seen a trend that many young scholars study their own. Okay, language is an advantage. So if you know the language, you can do much richer interviews, you have richer interaction, all of that. And they can, of course, spend time learning the language beforehand in order to do it. But they often choose their own society, their self, which is on all counts the same. So location, the urban rather than the rural in particular, their own caste, maybe their own class, or some particular cultural practice or dimension which they're familiar with. Often it may be for good reasons that they have questions about it. They feel they have not understood what it is. But what it also can do is hamper their ability to question the givens in both their own society and in the society, in the group, in the sort of practice which they may be studying. Now, understanding India, then, the India as a self, means bringing together multiple such studies of varied regions, varied castes, various castes, class relations, caste relations, religious beliefs, voices, research questions. So what we have to keep in mind is that most studies can only be a slice of India. And if we make some effort to go beyond our immediate community, then we may better understand both that and what the cultural and social processes that make India, make relations around us are. One more thing, it's also the case that the lines between anthropology and sociology have been crossed globally, especially because of the critiques of colonial anthropology and with development studies becoming part of many anthropology and sociology departments. So that the locations and methods of both anthropology and sociology have sort of crossed, have become integral to each other. And yet, of course, there are those disciplinary histories which we might think about.
My last question to you is, how has your work as a sociologist influenced your worldview?
So I think I've already spoken about this maybe, and where I've pointed out that if one's sociology or social science is done with depth and with critical consciousness, there is a dialectical relationship between one's work as a sociologist and one's worldview, even if only one of sort of increment and addition. Now, my early studies of sociology and my early research soon led me to question my own individualist worldview. By the time I actually started my research, I had already moved beyond what was my initial worldviews. Now, subsequently, my work has not changed some of my views. For example, that women are structurally oppressed, that gender is socially constructed, though biology does have meaning in that women are also differentiated by other social divisions, such as class and caste, religion, region. That is also the idea that multiple pluralities make us up as social persons. However, my work and my life experiences have nuanced each other. And within the materialist perspective, the dialectical materialist perspective, which I broadly do build on, I have come to pay more attention to varied structural oppressions, to belief and emotion, to people's perceptions, to why perceptions persist, how belief is shaped and refined, to trying to understand that. And of course, increasingly more attention also to agency and resistance, to seeing how those may be made, moving beyond the assumption that these are all rationally engendered, trying to understand how the multiple layers of social life make them. And I find that actually I am constantly bringing in my sociological learnings from over decades into my everyday life to guide me in my thinking, to guide me in my interaction. And from that, again, my everyday interactions may come back as questions into my research. And this is very often the start of research for many people. We have a puzzle about our everyday life or something which someone has said to us. And then we start thinking about it and then thinking, okay, I'm not being able to explain it. Either I don't have enough knowledge about it or I don't understand it. And there is this research, this dialectical relationship which goes on between one's research and one's worldview, one's understanding of what can be and cannot be. So I think that's what I would be able to say on this. Of course, I could say a lot more also.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for giving us your time, your insights. We wish you the best in all your work ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been a good experience. All the best in your enterprises too.